the IOE, and I'm pleased to be your moderator today. I will only say 3 things at the beginning. The first one is please mute yourself. B, please engage. This is your conference. You can do that through the chat function, and then we will follow up. And 3, please put in your name and also the name of your organization, which makes it much easier for us actually when engaging with you. With that, I directly would like to give over to Roberto Silva Santos, who also now appears as Matthias Thorns in the name. You also have to rename yourself, for giving us introductory remarks. Over to you, Roberto.
Thank you. Now it's better. Well, welcome to all of you. I'm just trying to make some adjustments. Okay. Welcome to all of you. Thank you also to BIAC, and I see Hani, I see also there Drago, for this joint effort that we are undertaking, which I think has a high degree of pertinence. I know that we have been, in the recent times, been handling perhaps the most dramatic, the most severe, the most devastating social and economic crisis, and perhaps the worst scenario will come in the coming months. Not enter into the negative trend. We need really to anticipate a situation in which we can tackle both items, that we are trying to connect here, corruption and human rights, in a much more efficient manner, in a much more ambitious manner. And the role of business and employees organization is critical, is important, not just because of their capacity to bring their companies with them, not just because of their capacity also to create strong networks against corruption or to improve the efficiency, but also because their capacity to advocate, their influence. This is the centenary of IOE, and I always say that perhaps it's not the best year to celebrate the centenary, but if we have learned something during the last 100 years, is that the power of our network is precisely the fact that our organizations in 150 countries are independent, are the most representative, and they have a strong capacity of influence at national level in the policy agenda, and that's which makes the difference. What we are bringing here is something that that was already due for a long time, which is the anti-corruption practices that companies can bring together with BIAC. But what I have to say is that we, IOE and BIAC, have not come along with it. We have here in this event the other partners that are working in a daily basis with our organizations. On one side, the Working Group on Business and Human Rights, and we have to thank Anita for joining us, but also OECD, which is the partner of BIAC. In our case, is the ILO. And we are also working with other UN agencies and organizations. And at the end of the day, that's what matters. Is not just this event itself, but what we will be able to achieve after it. What kind of action we can undertake in order to have a different scenario now that we talk about sustainability, which put the ambition and which put the efficiency when it's needed. So I don't want to take much time. The only element also that I want to raise here as an addition is that when we deal with human rights and also with corruption issues, we have to bear in mind the huge component of informality that we have in face of us. If we can say that there has been a failure in the last 10, 20, 30 years, is the fact that we have not improved much on the reduction or the transition towards formality for many reasons. But one of them has to do also with our limited impact, perhaps, on corruption, and also our lagging behind in the area of human rights. So that's also a way to put the ambition in an area which will be critical also to have a different scenario, the informal sector. Without more delay, I just want to pass the floor to Hani. I want also to thank her also for the effort and for the joint cooperation that a sister organization as business at the OECD has proved to be for the IOE. Thank you very much for listening to me.
Thank you, Roberto. And indeed, the IOE together with BIAC have created a guide on how to better link the anti-corruption and human rights agenda. You will find the guide on the IOE website, on the BIAC website, of course. And I really would like also to thank Ina for her great work on this guidance which she has created. And if you didn't have time to read it, it was all an invitation for you. Hani will give you a quick go through this guidance to explain what are the main findings and also what are the main recommendations. Over to you, Hani.
Thank you very much, Matthias. Thank you, Roberto. Let me start by saying I couldn't agree more with what you said, and let me also start by saying that I very much, Ina and I very much enjoyed the very constructive cooperation with IOE, our sister organization, on this. Matthias, since you mentioned Ina up front, let me also highlight the enormous contribution that Ina has made in bringing all this together. I would also underline that this guide has actually been very member driven. So it didn't come out of nowhere. It was actually companies, business organizations that contacted us with the request, can you develop such a guide? Because it was felt that it was really needed. Now, let me go to the first slide, why connecting the human rights and anti-corruption agendas is important. First of all, we came to the conclusion that anti-corruption and human rights have a lot in common. Anti-corruption, corruption, human rights violations share many of the similar root causes. They thrive in similar environments, in particular where there is weak governance, weak rule of law. And of course, they pose similar reputational, financial, legal risks to companies. So companies take these issues very seriously, but they're often addressed in different departments and in a siloed approach. And that's why we came up with this guide. So now on the aim of the guide, next slide. Okay. So the aim of the guide is, first of all, to understand the synergies and differences that exist between these two major challenges. We want to make a contribution to emerging policy discussions, and we are very pleased to hear also here today from the UN and from the OECD what is happening in these areas. Of course, we want to support anti-corruption human rights experts in companies with practical tips and strategies. So this is really meant to be a practical guide. And then you will see at the end of the guide, there is also a very extensive overview of resources that exist in both in the field of anti-corruption and human rights. There are legal instruments and practical guidance, and we felt it was very important to bring these all together. Now, I'd also like to say a few words what the guide is not, because we had quite some discussion on this. So the guide is not a prescriptive list of actions of what companies should do. It is not an attempt to formally merge two agendas, and it is not a reference point for any legislative initiatives. And we really like to be very clear on this because this came up in the discussion a couple of times. So our emphasis is really on providing practical guidance to companies and also to national business and employers organizations. So what the guide does, it offers ideas for leveraging synergies where this is feasible and desirable. So we don't try to merge it all, but where it makes sense, we believe it's of mutual benefit to leverage these synergies. It raises questions for self-assessment. So there's a very practical part where you have questions that practitioners in companies can look at and see what applies to them. And then, of course, the guide recognizes that there is no one size fits all. And that's always, like, from the business point of view, very important that we have this flexibility. So it's not set in stone, and companies can apply it the way they wish. Now, I'd also like to mention a bit about the differences. I mean, we heard a lot about why it makes sense to do this, but I'd also like to underline that in many ways, I mean, corruption, human rights are different and are treated differently. And for the sake of time, I'd just like to mention two things. On the focus side, for corruption, the focus is a lot on criminalization, the emphasis on the perpetrators, whereas for human rights, it's a very victim-centered approach. And then the last point, how companies deal with this from an organizational point of view. For anti-corruption, it's often the legal compliance departments that are in charge. And for human rights issues, it's often in the areas of sustainability, corporate responsibility, supply chains, or labor teams. Now, the next slide. But despite these differences, we strongly believe that a more coordinated approach in many areas makes sense. As I said before, I mean, the intention is not to replace existing work on anti-corruption human rights in the respective company departments. But what we want to do with this guide is to facilitate information sharing and prevent duplication of efforts where it makes sense. Also, and this is often being said, I mean, Drago, this will sound familiar to you from all the integrity forums that we participated in. We really believe that we need a broader notion of business integrity and business ethics. I'd also like to underline that obviously business can't do it alone. So business is surely committed, very committed, but we also need governments to do their part. And that we also underline again in this guide is that company efforts can complement but cannot replace government efforts. And we also want to underline again that we, in the supply chain due diligence, we cannot have complete oversight over all the suppliers. So this is something we would like to underline again. Then we are also building on existing guidance. So our guide does not exist in isolation. We, of course, take as one of the basis founding documents always the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, with the respect and remedy framework. Of course, we have the OECD guidelines for multinational enterprises, which are the most comprehensive government-backed instruments for responsible business conduct. And the OECD guidelines are particularly interesting in this respect because they have both an anti-corruption chapter and a chapter on human rights, in addition to a number of other chapters. Then there's also the OECD due diligence guidance for responsible business conduct. Just like to underline, this is not an instrument like the OECD guidelines. It's a practical guide which provides practical information on the due diligence steps and processes as foreseen in the OECD guidelines. And then, of course, there's the OECD good practice guidance on internal controls, ethics, and compliance, which also provides practical measures for compliance programs, and OECD is currently looking at this as well. So all this has been taken into consideration, and our guide is intended to build on these existing guidances. Now, this is actually our main part, the practical guidance, questions for consideration. So you will find in the guide an entire section which summarizes, gives a list of questions that company practitioners can take into consideration as they look towards having a more coordinated approach. So we look at issues such as initial risk assessment. For example, how can anti-corruption human rights experts work together, connect for data information sharing. We have the important point of embedding human rights and anti-corruption in the corporate culture, how to raise awareness, including at executive level, then building on experience and existing structures. This is looking at how to strengthen information flow, for example, through cross-functional working groups, using synergies in due diligence processes. Here we have specific questions, for example, what human rights questions can be added to anti-corruption due diligence and vice versa. 5, establishing coordinated training programs. Again, here we're looking at synergies and explore the possibility of joint trainings in certain areas. And then 6, 7, and 8, it's all about like the reporting, joint reporting mechanisms where practical and appropriate, supporting internal reporting mechanisms, and of course also reporting to external stakeholders. So how can we raise awareness and how can we draw on synergies, because both departments are extensively involved in reporting initiatives. And then, of course, we underline the importance of engaging cooperation and collective action. Cooperation, we need cooperation across the board. We need cooperation within the company. We need cooperation with stakeholders. We need a cooperation with regional governments and with governments. And then the next slide. Yep. So, as I mentioned up front, at the end of the slide, the guide, we also have an extensive overview of resources that exist, both in the fields of anti-corruption and human rights. It's actually quite lengthy and quite colorful. What we try to do is to identify those that are just for human rights, that are just for anti-corruption, and instruments that address both sides. So here we have, of course, key international standards like the UN Guiding Principles, the M&E Guidelines, the Anti-Bribery Convention, and others. We have other related standards and guidance. I have to say we were surprised when we put this together how much is out there. There's guidance on SOEs, on export credits as it relates to human rights or to anti-corruption. Then the G20 and B20 have been extremely active in this field as well. There have been anti-corruption action plans and specific guidances. There's a wealth of regional standards, and there's also practical guidance, like the very good practical guidance that is provided by the IOE. We also, of course, have our M&E guidelines brochure in there. So we'd really like to encourage you to look at all the guidance that is out there. And then we've also included a couple of company examples. And we are very pleased actually to hear today in the course of the discussion from the company experts who will present them. And I just like to mention also that, I mean, we have 3 examples in there right now. We very much hope that we will be able to collect additional examples. We always believe that it's important to share good practice when this is possible. So we'd like to encourage other companies who participate here today to also share the good practice, which we would like to include. And that brings me to the last slide. Yeah, so here you see our contact details. So Matthias and I have been working very closely. Most of the credit goes to Ina, as I said up front. You also find Ina's email address. If you have any feedback, please let us know. So from our point of view, we very much hope that this guide will provide useful. We hope that the practical ideas will give ideas to company practitioners to maybe do something differently in the future. And I would also like to thank again our colleagues from our members again, the participants from international organization and UN, and in particular also our OECD friends for joining us today. Thank you.
Thank you, Hani, for giving us this practical overview. And I put the email address where you can find, or not email address, sorry, the internet address where you can find the guide in the group chat. So just go there and then you can download the guidance if you haven't done so yet. And really, as Hani has said, this is a living document. So please send us your best practical example, and we would be more than happy to include that and any other comments and suggestions you might have. With that, we really want to do now a deep dive into the question how to better interlink the human rights and anti-corruption agenda. And we will start with the UN and the OECD perspective. I'm very happy that we have a contribution by Anita Ramasastry from the UN Working Group on Business and Human Rights. The UN Working Group has produced a document for the UN Human Rights Council exactly on this topic. She can't join us today because of the timing, because she's at the West Coast, so it would be in the middle of the night for her, but she has sent us a video. So Monique, if you could please send. Excellent.
Greetings from Seattle. As chair of the UN Working Group on Business and Human Rights, I'm honored to join this high-level conference on connecting the human rights and anti-corruption agendas. I'm sorry not to be with you in person, but the time difference was not in my favor today. I congratulate the Business and Industry Advisory Committee at the OECD and the International Organization of Employers for the launch of their new guide on connecting the business and human rights and anti-corruption agendas. The nexus between business and human rights and anti-corruption was the focus of the UN Working Group's recent report to the UN Human Rights Council. We presented this report in July of 2020, and we are pleased to see the topic is gaining momentum in many fora, including at the OECD and the World Economic Forum. Today, I want to highlight why I think this topic is so important and why we need additional work to help guide states and the private sector with respect to this issue. The concept of responsible business conduct, asking business to prevent corruption and human rights abuses in their operations and business relationships, is not new. For example, the UN Global Compact has both concepts embedded in its core principles. Similarly, the OECD Guidelines for Multinational Enterprises has a concept of responsible business conduct that calls on companies to address human rights risks to people and corruption risks. Thus, the idea of alignment is one that has been introduced before, but until now has not really been implemented in practice. The pandemic provides an opportunity to consider corruption in business and human rights anew, at a time when corruption in supply chains can present significant human rights challenges. Truly, corruption in global supply chains can now be a matter of life or death. Bribes paid may be paid in supply chains to avoid government health and safety inspections, for example, in factories. Corruption results in essential products such as food and medicine being diverted from public market supply chains into private hands. Of course, the other reason that we are seeing a focus on connecting the human rights and anti-corruption agendas is that human rights is becoming regulatory, with the movement in European states towards mandatory human rights due diligence. With this move from voluntary to mandatory, the question of how existing compliance teams within companies will start to address human rights issues has become a more urgent issue within the private sector. It is at this critical juncture that we see the need to tackle corruption and human rights issues and to look for greater alignment of policies, processes, and corporate leadership within the private sector. The working group was pleased to help set off this chain reaction. Our report highlights the need for states to act in an integrated fashion to ensure companies are preventing corruption in their business activities, as well as ensuring respect for human rights is called for in the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. We show how states, business, and civil society can better ensure that businesses are part of the solution, not the problem. Given that businesses can be both drivers and beneficiaries of corruption, it is imperative to consider the harms caused to rights holders by corruption. Our report highlights where corruption leads to systematic business-related human rights abuses and its impact on individuals and communities. The working group has observed during its country visits that businesses have used bribery and trading and influence to gain an illegal economic advantage often, while simultaneously imperiling the rights of vulnerable and marginalized groups. For example, companies may pay a bribe to illegally acquire a government permit or license, only to circumvent proper procedures to ensure environmental and health safeguards when building a dam or a mine, for example. The report considers the 3 pillars of the guiding principles: protect, respect, and remedy framework. Regarding Pillar 1, both home and host states should do more to incorporate human rights impacts when addressing corruption. Any focus on responsible business conduct and human rights should include anti-corruption efforts. States should ensure greater policy coherence when countering corruption and protecting human rights in order to make explicit their expectations of the private sector in relation to responsible business conduct. Guidance on respecting human rights and addressing corruption is needed, for example, to assist businesses operating overseas. Concerning Pillar 2 of the guiding principles, while many companies have implemented anti-corruption compliance programs responding to criminal laws against bribery, they have largely not done so in relation to human rights. It's imperative for more businesses to engage in human rights due diligence in alignment with Pillar 2. Furthermore, if a market or sector is rife with corruption, this should raise a red flag that there is also high risk of human rights abuses. These risks need to be intertwined. As part of their commitment to sustainable development, businesses need to identify their negative human rights impacts and prevent and mitigate and remediate them, and also to address corruption. The report acknowledges that in many businesses, sustainability, supply chain, and human rights departments operate independently from legal and compliance departments. This poses challenges to a coordinated and aligned approach to preventing and addressing corruption and negative human rights abuses. Embedding human rights and anti-corruption efforts is easier in some categories than in others. For example, integrating human rights related questions into baseline screening of business partners, where issues of a third party's risks for bribery, fraud, and human rights abuse can be screened simultaneously. Since presenting its report, the working group has continued to work on connecting the business and human rights agendas and anti-corruption agendas. In July 2020, it convened 2 discussions, one on connecting the dots, again a high-level discussion, and a second one on beyond compliance that drilled down on anti-corruption and human rights due diligence processes. The working group will hold a session focusing on promoting accountability and remedy for corruption-linked human rights abuses at the UN Forum on Business and Human Rights in November. We are also planning an expert meeting to map out the different ways in which companies can address issues of alignment of their anti-corruption and human rights efforts, and the OECD-BIAC guide will be a useful reference point for future work and discussions. Finally, the UN General Assembly will hold a special session of the GA against corruption in June 2021. This is an opportunity to advance global thinking on the connection between these agendas and to drive policy coherence. Again, please accept the working group's congratulations, and we look forward to continued collaboration on this vital topic.
Before giving the floor now to the OECD perspective to Drago Kos, I would like to remind you to put any question you might have, any suggestion, comment into the chat. So we will be able then to follow up because we have Q&A after every session. With that, directly over to you, Mr. Kos. Thank you so much for joining.
Thank you, Chair, and good afternoon from Slovenia. I have to say that although we work very close with BIAC, this guide came as a surprise for us. We didn't know that anybody is working on it, and I have to say it was a positive surprise, not only because there is a guide now, but also because of the substantial, let's say, solutions in the guide. See, I think the biggest and the most positive achievement of the guide is the fact that there is no simple link between fighting corruption and fighting for human rights. They have several features in common, of course. They have similar root causes. They function in similar environments. Let's say countries with a high level of corruption usually are known also by low level of protection of human rights. But this still does not mean that all corruption cases are directly infringing human rights, or that human rights can also be damaged through corruption. They run, let's say, the corruption and infringement of human rights, they run in parallel. They have so many similarities that it would be really pity that if we would not tackle them together. And this is also the reason why I think this guide is so important, because the managers, but also employees in the private sector, but also in the public sector, later on will have to understand that by doing one thing, you also assist doing the other one. Of course, fighting corruption is a bit more technical exercise, either corruption in the public sector or at the national level or the international level. But majority of our cases also have some, let's say, the ethical background. So we can easily see, in many of our cases, we can see the breaches of human rights which resulted directly or indirectly as a consequence of corruption offenses. There is, let's say, I read the guide carefully, all 9 chapters where things can run in parallel, where they can, let's say, assist each other. I found one thing missing. You see, there is an issue where the link between corruption and human rights is even closer. And this is the issue of trust. Say, speaking about enhancing the notion of corporate business integrity, I think this is our way in, or our chance to tackle both issues together. Namely, it's very clear, research has shown that high level of trust in a company is always correlated with low level corruption in the same company, which means the more employees and managers trust each other, or vice versa, the lower level of corruption you will have. Of course, the question is how we can increase trust. You know, you cannot come to the office and to the company and one day say, well, let it be trust. No, trust can be increased by some simple actions in the area of human rights. Protecting, let's say, different aspects of human rights will increase the trust of the employees, and on the second step, it will decrease corruption. So there is a direct link, and I think this should be our way in, how to connect the issues even more. I have the guide is doing this in a perfect manner. We can add this technical way in, so all companies will understand that. Let's start now with protecting human rights. They will understand that by protecting human rights, we will indirectly decrease corruption. And this is basically what we want to achieve. We want to achieve both goals. Now, the OECD is a huge organization. We deal with many, many issues. I'm just sharing the working group on bribery, which deals with enforcement of foreign bribery offenses. But we emphasize a lot the importance of corporate integrity. And here we get an excellent input from our friends from BIAC. And I think what we are discussing today should be the next topic for discussions, especially now when we are developing we are enhancing the standards which we adopted in 2009. And those standards will also contain one important part on corporate integrity, how to positively motivate companies to engage in corporate integrity. And well, I cannot promise that, but I'm sure that, let's say, the discussions on broadening the issue, the topic, broadening the notion, will also find, let's say, some very positive acceptance by our members. There are other parts of the OECD which deal with human rights much more extensively than we do. And what we will have to do, we'll just all together, when I say all together, means BIAC and the working library, we'll have to bring them all together. We'll have to discuss the issue, and we'll have to find a way how to enhance the synergies, which are there already. We just didn't look at them until now. And therefore, this guide is an important achievement. I appreciate it a lot. I'll be very happy to share it with all members of our working group, and I expect to have some very interesting debates in the future, how to fight corruption with emphasizing the protection of human rights even more.
Thank you so much, Mr. Kos, and particularly also to stressing and pointing out the importance of trust, which I fully support. It's a main issue, and it's for sure something to look at into the revised drafting. Now, coming from the UN level, from the OECD level, we really would like to give the business perspective. And we start here with Corinne Lagache, who is the chair of the BIAC Anti-Corruption Committee. Corinne, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Matthias. Do you hear me well?
Perfect.
Okay.
Perfect.
Okay. So thank you very much. As chair, of course, of the business at OECD, the BIAC Anti-Corruption Committee, I would like to express my appreciation that the guide has been finalized after a long discussion among committee members. And thank you again to Annie for coordinating so well this work. I would like to emphasize that companies establish anti-corruption compliance program not only to ensure that they act in line with the rules and regulations, but also because they view them as strategic investment to ensure a sustainable development of the company, to protect the company's reputation as a truthful partner and prevent costs associated with potential misconduct, for instance, due to criminal proceedings. Business actions, however, should be complemented by government's efforts to set up a conducive and enabling policy environment. Government can support companies' proactive engagement by providing them with incentives, such as more trust, as mentioned by Drago, easier access to public tendering, and so on. This is a topic we have to work on. Also, in developing additional, more targeted guidance on and clarifications on what is expected from company compliance program. This should be done on an OECD harmonized basis in order to avoid confusion for companies working at the international level, which face different regulation, different guidance, which is complicated for them. This may be particularly relevant for SMEs, which often face considerable challenges in establishing comprehensive compliance structures and trying to work at the international level. We also underline that governments should walk the talk, that is, they should lead by example. We therefore hope that our guide can also be of practical interest to state-owned enterprises. As we also stress in our guide, business cannot do it alone. Corruption often occurs in an environment of weak governance. Thus, it is essential that government effectively and consistently enforce anti-corruption laws and strengthen governance to address the root cause of corruption, including passive corruption. Adherence to international standards play an important role in this regard. In addition to fostering adherence, it must be full implementation of existing standards to ensure a global level playing field. Governments should be also helped to raise awareness and promote education. With respect to integrity, this is a link between human rights and anti-corruption, which can also help to shape a broader anti-corruption culture in society, which be vital to shaping a conducive environment, not only for the fight against corruption, but all the integrity matter, and especially the protection of human rights. This leads me to the key points of today's discussion. Business wants to underline the link between anti-corruption and human rights. These interlinkages between corruption and human rights, where corrupt acts can contribute to adverse human rights impacts, and where a lack of respect for human rights often goes hand in hand with poor outcomes in the fight against corruption, call for a better understanding of the two agendas. With the guide, we want to make a contribution to foster a practical approach on the company level and help bring down policy silos. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Corinne. That is really appreciated. I would now turn to Mtunzi Dwaba, who has many, many hats. One is to be the chair of the IOE Policy Working Group on Human Rights and Responsible Business Conduct. Mtunzi has holidays, so I really appreciate that you take the time to get out of your holidays to join us today for this important conference. I would like to also use this opportunity to thank Monique, who is responsible for running the show here behind the scene, and no one sees her because she's also on holidays. She's visiting her mother in the Netherlands, and I'm really appreciate that Monique is doing that during her holidays also. With that, Tunzi, over to you from the human rights perspective.
Thank you, Matthias. Good morning, good afternoon. I think for Brent, you said it was good night. And thank you to you, Matthias, and colleagues that have preceded my speaking to the different colleagues that are connected. The conference that we have now, this webinar, is about tearing down the silos. Tearing down the silos within companies, and would go much broader and say tearing down the silos in international organizations, and most importantly, in governments and national administrations. It is about ensuring that people and departments work with each other instead of next to each other. To tear down silos is a buzzword to which everyone subscribes, but to implement and to trigger change, as we all know, is very hard. Organizational structures and walls are often very difficult to move and to overcome. The IOE-BIAC guidance, which Hani has presented, outlines the benefits of doing so, and more importantly, the way of doing it, the how, as we would say. Coming from a human rights perspective, I must stress that strong collaboration with compliance units makes not only absolute sense, but I would go further and say it is a must. Human rights risks and actual violations are very often linked to bribery and corruption. When trade unions and labor inspectors are bribed, major human rights are at risk. When within a company or its supplier, people need to pay managers to get a job, human rights are at risk. And at this stage, I would also agree completely with what Drago said earlier about trust. I think trust is absolutely critical for this process to work. When government permits for mining or any other tenders and services are depending on bribes, human rights are again at risk. When courts are not independent, access to remedy is at risk. I could continue by adding to this list and go on for a while, but I'm certain you've got the idea. It is absolutely clear that there is a strong link between human rights and the anti-corruption agenda. We will hear from companies in the next panel regarding some concrete examples on how the human rights and compliance functions work together. Obvious areas of collaboration include the risk assessment and due diligence. This is, by the way, not only much more effective as we get a much more comprehensive understanding of the risks, but is of course also much more cost efficient. Instead of having, for instance, 2 audits, 1 might be sufficient. Training is another area. Instead of training staff separately on compliance and human rights, joint training initiatives might be more cost effective and show the interlinkages better between the issues and trigger joint follow-ups, which also assist with being more productive. Using existing structures in a company helps. If there's already a whistleblower hotline, for example, a good step might be to broaden the scope of this hotline to specific human rights issues. Again, we will hear many more examples in a minute from the companies. Both human rights violations as well as corruption are often systemic issues which can only be tackled through collective action. Employer organizations can play a key role in this regard as they facilitate peer learning and the development of alliances between companies as well as with other stakeholders. And they also speak up vis-a-vis governments when it is difficult for an individual company to do so. And they are also often directly engaged in policy making through their participation in economic and social councils. I encourage you all to make much better use of federations to address systemic issues, such as, in this case, human rights violations and corruption. Finally, I really appreciate that the OECD and the UN Working Group are looking more strongly on interlinking the two agendas. At the end, international organizations have a key role to play in raising awareness and building capacity in the public sector. We need much more action from governments. In the dimension of anti-corruption, there is a clear need for governments to actively address the demand side of bribery. Similarly, for the human rights agenda as well, the UNGPs make it clear that while corporations have a responsibility to respect human rights, states have a duty to protect human rights. This is not to just throw the ball into the government field, but to ensure that we see progress among all actors. Collaboration more than ever during these hard times should be the name of the game. At the end, it comes down to the simple wisdom that if you want to tear down silos, you need a common goal, and you need willing people to effect the change via implementation from all the different actors. We all aim for companies to better fulfill their responsibilities, to respect human rights, and desist from being tempted to participate in corrupt activities, that governments better implement their duty to protect human rights and combat corruption so that we develop sustainable and fair societies. Thank you very much, colleagues. Thanks, Matthias. Thanks to everybody.
Thank you, Mthunzi. And we directly have a question to both of you, Corinne and Mthunzi. And the question is whether this guidance is really a benchmark which every company should be expected to follow. So perhaps, Corinne, directly over to you. What is your assessment? What is the character? Is this guidance? Is this recommendations? Or is this a benchmark?
It is not a benchmark because, to our opinion, I don't know if we already have these two agendas put in parallel and in connection. Nevertheless, it's a development strategy paper, recommendation, way to work. And as it was mentioned earlier, we have to work on it further in order to develop more practical ways to implement these two agendas together. So I encourage the people who make these remarks to read it and to provide with their inputs in order for us to develop and have a very robust paper afterwards.
Thank you, Corinne. And Mthunzi, before you answer, I directly have another question to you. So we are time effective here. It is about the cultural shifts which are needed to bring human rights more into management systems and compliance systems. If you have also an answer to that one.
Well, two things, Matthias. Firstly, the first is to say d'accord with Corinne, and agree with her that this is not an attempt to have a benchmark. This is all about ensuring that there are recommendations that we can all work on. I mean, the last thing we need is more binding documents. There's binding documents everywhere that make no sense and that just discourage people's enthusiasm and incentivization and so on. And we don't need that. It's going to waste the party. But secondly, in terms of the cultural shift, of course, you know, as I said when I spoke, it is easier said than done. The reality of it and where things make a difference is when we actually do the implementation. So it's very important that we have attitudinal change and have education, consultations, help people understand. It's by helping people understand, it's by incentivizing people, it's by training people that we're going to change this cultural thing. And remembering, and we must never forget, that what is a cultural situation in one country and in one region may be very different in other regions. So we've also got to be very sensitive to the very indigenous situations of the different countries and regions and not impose things, because we might lose the people instead of them working with us. So hope that helps. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tunsi. Nicola Monucci, my understanding is you have a huge experience on anti-corruption issues, working for the OECD for a long time on these issues. You want to come in for 60 seconds to also give a perspective. So over to you, Nicola.
Thank you, Matthias. I am the culprit for asking the question on benchmark, and I use the word benchmark not to suggest that it was legally binding at all, but I think one of the important points of this document is that it represents pretty much all the business in the world. If you put the IOE and BIAC, and I think you can name it, and I can understand that you're prudent, but I think it is a landmark document, and congratulations to all of you. My experience is that there is another point of conjunction in these two agendas, and Corinne lightly touched upon it, but I will be, one of the advantages not of being at the OECD anymore is that I can be more outspoken than ever. So the elephant in the room are governments in both areas. And governments very often in both areas are more the problem than the solution. So the question is, one area in which indeed, and I think Mthunzi was referring to it, in which there are a lot of synergies is through collective action. You need collective action both in anti-corruption and human rights. And I was thinking about, have you thought about how you can merge the two agendas in terms of collective action, and how those two agendas could really coincide so that the same group of companies that are doing collective action in anti-corruption could expand it to human rights or vice versa? Thank you so much, Nicola. That's a great question. And Tunsi is not only the chair of the IOE Policy Working Group on Human Rights and Responsible Business Conduct, but he is also the IOE Vice President, so very closely connected to federations, because this is a question directly linking, I believe, to the rule of employers federation. Tunsi, over to you.
Thank you, Matthias. I'm not really sure what is over to me now. What do you want me to say now? I thought I'd covered everything. I answered all your questions.
Well, Nicola mentioned the point how to ensure that collective action on the ground is linking the human rights and the anti-corruption agenda, right? This is about Nicola's suggestion that, we need to go further. This is not about one company, this is about collective action. How in collective action we can merge the two issues. And I believe you as the IOE Vice President of an Employers Federation could speak to that.
Okay, so you're just abusing me further. I thought that Nicola was just agreeing with the whole statement. Sorry, Nicola, that I missed that nuance in your statement. Absolutely. I think the importance, of course, is that wearing the other hat of dealing with our federations and members throughout the 159 countries, 159 members in 150 countries that we work with, is to ensure that at a national level, we are able to we don't want to reinvent the wheel. We ensure that our colleagues, our members are able to give the guidance. And hence in my statement, I was saying, let's please work with our federations to attend and deal with all these systemic issues, because the reality of it is they are able to lead on our behalf. Sometimes as companies, it's far more difficult for us to challenge, for example, the governments, because, we might be implicated in a way in not being able to do good business. But if you leave it to the federations, and your federation in your country is able to represent you, but also working with the IOE in our capacity as linking all these issues, we are able to do that and also save you the time of having to come up with the rules when there is a way of doing it. All you need to do is just customize it for your very peculiar circumstances in every country and every region. I hope that helps.
Thank you so much, Tunsi. And we directly move over to the second panel, which focuses on the practical company examples. And what I would like to do is to rearrange the order a bit, because as you all know, Brent Wilton is speaking from New Zealand. So he's in the middle of the night, and we are so grateful for you, Brent, to do that for us, to stay up all night. So in order to give you 40 minutes more sleep, I would suggest we directly start with you, Brent. Brent is the Director of Global Workplace and Human Rights at the Coca-Cola Company, and we will give us a practical experience from the Coca-Cola Company, how they break down the silos. Over to you, Brent.
Thank you, Matthias, and thank you very much to both the IOE and BIAC for this initiative. I think it's an incredible first step forward. I believe that this is a journey. It's not a destination. One of the things we've found around the world when it comes to corruption, it changes. People morph corruption into different ways you'd never thought about. So you're forever having to whack-a-mole in terms of trying to address these issues. Within the Coca-Cola Company, we've made a very strong position around anti-corruption for decades now. We're over 132 years old. It's always been part of how we do business, to the issue of trust that was mentioned earlier. So we have in our Code of Business Conduct very specific requirements with regards to corruption, bribery, and any other issue which is of that type. If people make claims that corruption has occurred, we have a whistleblower system. They can lodge complaints. Those complaints are then followed up by a team of investigators to ascertain whether there's any veracity in what is being said. And if there is, it then comes to a multifunctional committee called the Ethics and Compliance Committee, of which I am a member, along with legal and some very senior members of the executive leadership team, who then discuss whether or not we're satisfied that the threshold has been met, that they have breached the code, and therefore penalties flow. So we have quite a robust system in place that deals with that. But also we have to deal with other issues like sanctions now, which are also having implications in the way in which you can or can't do business, which require, again, the involvement of our security people and also our sanctions team. I think it's very important, though, to come back to talk about what was said by Mthunzi as well. This needs to be a national conversation. It's not just a company conversation. I agree with that totally. It has to be expressed in terms of that national reality, and that it is addressed in ways that can actually make progress. That's very important. But I think it's also a huge opportunity for collaboration, not just amongst employers, but also other members of society. Around the world, we are struck by the number of NGOs who are working very diligently to try and address issues of governmental corruption in particular, but not only. And then you have the trade unions who are also concerned about what the impacts of corruption are on their incomes and their ability to function as an entity. So I think you have a perfect melting point here to bring together a lot of different voices at national level to really start to move this forward. I take the point that it is often difficult for individual companies to speak on their own. We've experienced some of those difficulties around the world where we get sudden tax inquiries, we get suspension of businesses licenses to operate, all sorts of retaliation can occur. So it is important that we work through representative organizations like the IOE members in order to be able to handle that. The other issue is, of course, that corruption comes in very many different ways, as I said, and sometimes it seems innocuous. We had a big challenge in Myanmar where we had people who were trying to get money out of our drivers for what they called tea money. Now that sounds very, very minor, doesn't sound like much, but it is actually corruption. So we had to issue all of our drivers there with a notice that they could show to these people that said, if I pay you anything, I will be sacked. And we found that that actually was very helpful in making sure that those people weren't subjected to that sort of harassment. Other challenges you get are where you are operating countries where government has lost control of certain regions, like even in Mexico, where these semi-autonomous groups set up a quasi-government to control a very large territory. And they start charging fees for you to enter and come through their territory, either to deliver or pass through in transit. That's a very tricky one to deal with because you don't know quite what that money's for. Is it actually going to be for the provision of social services, which they claim, or is it to buy guns? So those sort of quandaries occur, and when that happens, we bring together a multidisciplinary team from across the business to go through and scenario discuss how best to deal with that. We will also bring in that instance, our independent bottling partner who is involved in that actual reality on the ground to make sure that they are comfortable with what we're suggesting to them and they are able to give us the nuances of what's actually going on in their own community. So I'm speaking quite quickly because there's a lot of people to talk, and time is always an enemy in these sorts of events. But I can only say that this is going to become more of an issue. Roberto at the outset talked about the vulnerability of the informal economy. We've seen that. We've seen waste pickers having to pay fees to gangs to keep them safe from attack by that gang. Just terrible things. And so the informality is driving increased risk of corruption and bribery to those most vulnerable. And again, as we do our human rights due diligence and as we get lower down into our supply chains, those issues come together. Human rights and corruption come together very quickly, and you need to have a coordinated and complete response rather than try to deal with it through silos. So with that, I will stop. Just one last point, training. We do compulsory training on bribery and corruption each year. Every member of our team has to, or the company has to go through this training. It is monitored to make sure it is completed. If it's not, then that's a disciplinary matter in itself. So people take this training very seriously. It's always updated and it's very interactive. It gives you scenario settings where people are able to answer questions based on fact situations. So again, you have to keep on top of this. You have to keep reminding people. It may seem innocuous, but it is still bribery and corruption. It's hurting the business and it's often hurting others who are associated with other instances of bribery as you go down the chain. So thank you, Matthias. Thank you, Matunzi. Thank you, Hani, for a great event.
Thank you, Brent, for these very concrete examples and very concrete issues. This really shows that even the Coca-Cola company, it has real challenges with it when it comes to these questions. With that, I really would like to give over to Rauno Hoffmann, who is the head of policies at Novartis. Rauno, the floor is yours for your examples and your experience when it comes to linking the anti-corruption and human rights agenda.
Thank you, Matthias. Good morning, good afternoon. Can you hear me?
Perfect.
Perfect, excellent. So it's a pleasure to be here at this very important event and to present a practical example from Novartis in the area of third-party risk management. I would also send my congratulations to the IOE and to BIAC for this excellent document, which not only comes at the right point in time, I also think it provides really practical examples for employers, for companies, and they will consider this. I like, what Hani said before in the area of risk assessment, due diligence. Those are practical examples. I think they will help the companies. With respect to Novartis, what have we done? And I would like to explain a little bit what we have implemented in the area of third-party risk management. For this, I would like to go back to the year 2016-2017. So we have a human rights guideline for many years, and we also have standalone risk functions. And in 2016-2017, we then looked into it because the different risk functions conducted their assessments in isolation. So there was no possibility to have a comprehensive and complete picture on the risk that is associated with certain engagements. So what we have done then is to say, look, let's bring together the relevant risk functions. Here I talk about anti-bribery, I talk about labor rights, I talk about health, safety, environment, data privacy, and human rights as an umbrella risk function. So we all came together and developed a joint framework. In this framework, we all have to adhere to specific stages, but still the risk functions maintain their responsibility to tailor the process in order to address the relevant risk associated with certain third parties. However, with this framework, it allows us to deploy the different business processes. When I mean business processes, the anti-bribery due diligence process, labor rights assessment, etc., to one system, one tool. It also enabled us to standardize, to have more same step and sequences, to have a better picture that we can then show to the relevant committees in Novartis when it comes to the engagement. It also brings visibility on mitigation and remediation actions that are required from the different risk functions. So this is a framework that we have developed. At the same time, we have established a TPRM function. These TPRM functions will work and support the different risk functions when it comes to the individual assessments. So we have identified synergies and also have reduced the workload for certain areas in order to increase at the same time the effectiveness when it comes to certain engagements. Last but not least, we have this year established a new TPRM policy framework. And at the top of it is it's an overarching third-party risk management guideline. This is risk agnostic, meaning it covers all different risk areas that I mentioned, from anti-bribery over human rights and under the umbrella of human rights, labor rights, HSE, etc., in order to help our associates to understand what are the main principles that we expect them to do that are relevant when it comes to the assessment of third. So to also understand who should be contacted in case of questions. As part of this policy framework, we also have Novartis third-party code. This third-party code covers all relevant language that will be incorporated in the contracts with third parties, from anti-bribery, so our compliance language, at the same time also clearly articulated expectation when it comes to labor rights, child labor, etc., HSE, etc. All is in one document that will form part of an engagement that we have with a third party. And one maybe additional practical example from the area of TPRM that we have. So this year, we have also issued a COVID-19 good practice guidance for our third parties. We need to, as Novartis, we need to make sure that we can supply our medicine to patients so that we have no interruption. At the same time, we have also the responsibility that when it comes to the production of our products, that we that there are no, let's say, adverse impacts on our workers or the workers in our supply chain. So we developed a guidance that gives recommendation to third-party suppliers of Novartis, how they can, let's say, implement relevant expectations in this crisis, in this pandemic, for instance, related to physical distancing and to personal hygiene, etc. But also we use this as an opportunity to emphasize again the importance of our third-party code, in particular human rights, labor rights, etc., so that we basically build on the partnership, not only expect them to share information, but also give them recommendations how they can address some of the challenges that they face.
Thank you, Rauno. You also stressed very much the real importance of best practice and of training, which already Brent mentioned. It's important driver to bring not only their own staff, but also the suppliers on board on the agenda. With that, I would like to go over to Nicola Alocca, the Director for Risk Management at Atlantia. Nicola? I believe
yes.
Presentation. Perfect.
Yes, so I prepared a very short presentation. First of all, I would like to thank the BIAC for the invitation, and also IOE. In this session, I will represent Autostrade per l'Italia, which is a leader, if you go in the next slide, please, leader in design, construction, management of motorway infrastructure, and world leader in the development and implementation of toll safety and traffic control technologies. With more than 3,000 kilometers of motorways and more than 200 service areas, we have the role of bringing the country closer to the European socio-economic center of gravity. Unfortunately, last August 2018, a tragic event occurred affecting the company and all its employees. We have reacted and we activated a strategic transformation program that provided for strong management innovation, a revolution in the internal control system, and the launch of an investment and maintenance plan of 7.5 billion euros in 3 years, with a multiplier for the company economic system of 65 billion euros. And I think that these amounts enlarge the supply side and the demand side of bribery. So we clearly stated that Autostrade will achieve its business targets by effectively balancing profit and values in order to assure a sustainable development. To this end, we constantly promote respect for universal principles such as human rights, labor standards, environmental protection, and fight against corruption in our business strategy, in our daily operations, and in our culture. We are implementing these universal principles in an integrated way because we strongly believe that they share the same roots. For example, the duty to respect them is formalized in specific company documents such as the ethical codes, the code of conduct, the anti-corruption policy. They offer an integrated perspective as active values and rules that must be always jointly present in the performance of activities. Furthermore, a new department has been created, reporting directly to the CEO, in order to enable the synergies between all the key stakeholders and monitor the company ability to reach its targets in compliance with the law and ethical standards. If you go on the next slide, please. We translate the commitment to integrity and ethical standard into actions. For example, the first target of the 7.5 billion euros investment is the sustainable growth of the community where the projects are executed. The first purpose of the company is the common good, because in order to answer also what Drago said, in order to create trust, you have to believe as a company in the values, and you have to behave according to those specific values. We make business only with the suppliers with a strong reputation and which accept and shares our ethical standards. Following our discretionary responsibility, in addition to legal, economic, and ethical one, we sponsor anti-corruption master program in the major Italian universities. If you can go in the next slide. In conclusion, our community firmly believes that profit maximization is affected by an ethical limitation which must be recognized and integrated into the business vision. Earnings reached outside these limits should be not recognized as a profit by civil society. Healthy companies must optimize their profit by defining resilient, sustainable, and inclusive business plans. Today, not investing in integrated anti-corruption systems is like stopping the clock to save the time. It cannot be done. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nicola. And particularly also to focusing how to integrate ethical concerns into the management system. And that goes to the question actually we had earlier in the webinar, where the question was, how do we achieve this cultural shift, right? This cultural shift to include ethical considerations into the management systems. I would like now to turn over to Maria Rocha, who is the Deputy Director for Integrity at Repsol, an energy company which has different challenges, I believe. Over to you, Maria. You're muted. You have to unmute yourself. Now it works.
Now it's okay. Thank you. Thank you, Matthias. And thank you very much for organizing this event and for inviting me to participate and have the opportunity to share our experience at Repsol. I will try to summarize for you in a few minutes how connecting the anti-corruption and human rights agendas. Repsol aims to be a relevant actor among the communities where it operates in order to be recognized as a committed company that promotes the creation of shared value and sustainable development. Social investment projects are good examples of this commitment with human rights and sustainable development goals of 2030 agenda. In line with our commitment fostered from the top of the company, Repsol has a code of ethics and business conduct which establishes several guidelines that govern the conduct of all employees of Repsol groups and its subsidiaries and business partners worldwide. in carrying out their duties under commercial and professional relations. This code includes our commitment to respect human rights, in particular of those populations that may be more vulnerable everywhere we operate. The code also includes a list of measures to combat bribery and corruption and the procedures to follow in case of breach of the regulation. Additionally, the company has a human rights and anti-corruption policy, which were approved by the board of directors with the aim of respect internationally recognized human rights and conduct continuous human rights due diligence in our activities. The objective is to avoid and address such adverse impacts associated with our operations, supply chains, and other business relationships in accordance with international reference standards, such as United Nations Guideline Principle on Business and Human Rights and OECD guidelines for multinational enterprises. To guarantee our employees are aware for these regulations, a specific periodic training is prepared, which helps to understand to have better knowledge of our third parties with whom who have or are going to have business relationships. It's also important to say that we adopt some due diligence measures to help us learn about their human rights and corruption prevention policy. Our target is to help our business partners to understand the practical applications of our code and policies. In this sense, we ask them to know and comply with our code of ethics and conduct and our human rights and anti-corruption policies too, which are available on our website. We also include in our contracts specific clauses which guarantees that the third parties know our policies. Additionally, we include the possibility of exercise audit rights in these aspects as well. In this line, Repsol has an ethics and compliance channel that allows all employees and a third party to ask questions or communicate potential no compliance of the code of ethics and business conduct in a confidential and anonymous way, and without fear of retaliation. It is managed by an independent company and is available 24 hours per day, 3 days per week, by the phone and in the local language and online. We operate in many countries around the world, and the social investment projects may have compliance risk with regard to corruption, terrorist financing, and international sanctions and embargoes. In Repsol, compliance and human rights departments work together in a synergistic way, increasing the positive impact of social investment projects while fighting against corruption and respecting human rights. In this sense, and in order to reduce such risks, in 2018, a multidisciplinary with the participation, among others, of
Maria, you are muted. Perfect.
Okay, thank you very much. Legal Affairs and Security has developed a new regulatory framework for social investment projects with the aim of minimizing risks related to corruption and human rights abuses and carrying out risk-based due diligence. In 2019, the company finished successfully the process with the approval of the following standards. First standard, named Management of Social Investment, regulates the management of social investment in order to guarantee its transparency and optimize positive impact. And the second one, named Due Diligence of Third Parties, establishes the necessary measures to gain accurate knowledge of the third parties with Repsol has or will have a relationship regarding compliance risk. This standard formalizes the necessary due diligence measures that have to be adopted for the knowledge of the third parties with whom we interact or are going to interact. It also includes the procedure to follow when risks of corruption are identified. I hope this summary has been useful to you, and thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Maria. And I also found very important to note actually that the board of Repsol is directly involved. We have again and again coming up how important leadership is in the whole responsible business conduct human rights agenda. So it's really important also to see that the Repsol board is closely involved in your policies. Our last speaker on this panel is Elaine McKay. GTI has been extremely active when it comes to child labor, forced labor. The ARISE program has been very, very successful actually in eradicating child labor and forced labor. So Elaine, if you could speak a bit about how you put down the silos, tear down the silos within GTI, and how to ensure that in this fight about child labor, forced labor, you include the different relevant functions in the company.
Thank you very much, Matthias, and thank you to BIAC and OECD for hosting us. I think it's always difficult to speak after Brent Wilson from Coca-Cola. I mean, once he speaks, we might as well all just switch off our computers, lesson learned. But to be the last speaker in such a distinguished panel is very difficult because I have to come up with something that's possibly new or different. But I think some of the key themes that are relevant for companies who are here, but also for us, I'm just going to try and put a different spin on it so that you can understand the complexities when you deal with a company like ours. So to give you an idea, 45,000 people employed, brands sold in more than 120 countries, but fully vertically integrated. That means we deal with the sourcing supply chain for leaf, manufacturing, distribution, and sales. So different from some FMCG companies. But anytime you talk about FM, as in fast moving consumer goods, I think your products and your people become more risky than if you're dealing with different products, as an example. Now, when it comes to silos, I think the UN guiding principles almost set the silos up. And when I was preparing for this, I realized that our compliance team plays the role of the protect pillar. They draft the code of conduct. They have the policies called Know Your Customer, Know Your Supplier. They own policies and procedures. They even own the grievance mechanism. And in our company, it's called Your Voice. When it comes to the respect pillar, that's normally owned by the people who own corporate sustainability or the human rights piece, as in our business. And for example, they own our human rights due diligence process. And interestingly, we follow the OECD guidelines on agricultural supply chains, which talks to identifying what your risks are through impact assessments, prioritizing them, responding, measuring, and reporting what your impacts are. Differently, however, the way JTI approaches this is only by adding one, and it's called embed. That means embedding an understanding of human rights throughout our population of staff, regardless of where you are in the world. And I think this is something that Brent mentioned too, training and knowledge should be embedded in the business. Then it comes to remedy. Now, this is where it gets interesting because remedy generally is implemented in the supply chain. But the supply chain doesn't own the protect pillar. It doesn't really have much to do about the respect pillar, but they must clean up the mess. And this is where the breaking the silos is key. Imagine a world where we have zero tolerance for things like child labor, and we're not dealing with the global supply chain where child labor is prevalent because we deal with an agricultural commodity. It's taking the policy and making it real in our markets, in our leaf supply operations, and in our factories. And this is key. So some of the themes that we've learned. Number one, leadership, 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 leadership. The absence of leadership just goes to show that your policies, procedures, everything will fail. Number two, collaboration rather than competition. And that's true in our business as much as it is true when we talk to other companies like we're doing today. The third thing is not just about trusting the processes. It's very much about trusting the people. And this is what I've worked really hard to do in our companies, to create a trust-based environment. And you trust the leaf technician on the ground in Malawi when he tells you you have an issue as much as you trust the person who owns the human rights policy. Now, I asked for a snapshot of where we stand with Your Voice just before I spoke today, because you'll notice that my title is the only one that doesn't talk about compliance or workplace rights or anyone if you compare me with the other panels. I want to know, where do we stand? Just over 5 months, 177 cases came through to our reporting concerns mechanism or grievance mechanism. Only 5 related to corruption. 61 related to employment issues, starting, for example, with harassment, inappropriate behavior. 56 relate to fraud and theft. So it's very interesting that compliance is not picking high cases of corruption. But what's important to know is that 9 staff was terminated and 11 were issued with reporting, with written warnings. And that's interesting for me because it shows that, one, when people trust the process, they are likely to lodge a grievance. And number 2, the process through its completion, once investigations are done, people do lose their jobs. And this is important in building trust. However, the question I have to the people who own the protect pillar is, can a child or a worker on a tobacco farm in Tanzania, Brazil, Malawi, Zambia, Indonesia, or Bangladesh, are they able to access this grievance mechanism? And if the answer is no, does that fulfill our requirement insofar as the UN guiding principles are concerned? So the language we choose to use now in understanding this is generally that impact of financial corruption is on JTI, but impact of human rights is on the rights holder. Those are very important conversations to differentiate. Number two, there is this notion of financial gain when it comes to corruption and financial loss when it comes to human rights. So people tend to look at them differently. But finally, they are really, really good examples of integration in our business. And I think we'll find them if we ask them of others. But again, it is about the private sector collaborating, coming together to showcase this. Because more and more, if we don't do it, the laws will change and they will not take into account the essence of what is good practice when companies like Coca-Cola, ourselves, and others who are early adopters and have tried really hard to embrace the UN guiding principles in their entirety. So thank you very much for your time. I hope that I've been able to consolidate and not replicate what someone else has said.
Absolutely, and we really appreciate of that. So we're running out of time, but there's one important question I think we can bring to you as a companies, and I don't know who is raising first a hand, which is which rule for the international business and employers organization do you see? So anyone who want to offer an answer to this question from the companies who just spoke?
I can jump in quickly. It is about this global voice. It is about coherence. I mean, I think the point is people are using business, human rights, and corruption as a competitive tool when these issues are actually pre-competitive. And we must work to get together better. And the IOE for me is uniquely placed to be that shared voice of business. Because on our own, our voice is not even heard. But when we do come together, the voice is consolidated, and the word I like to use is amplified. And that's what I think is key in our area of the business.
Thank you. And Rauno, you opened your microphone.
Yeah, I think the guidance that you just issued, I think it's for me a direct answer to the question. So basically helping companies to understand and that there are opportunities to combine, to streamline efforts, to, let's say, make not only the area of compliance and anti-corruption more mature, but also human rights, to lift them up at the same level. So provide guidance, provide practical examples from other companies that are part of the association. I think this could be, for me, a role that international organizations can play.
Thank you. And Nicola is today challenging us. Another question of Nicola Bonucci, and it's a good one, asking whether the boards are really looking into human rights issues as much as on anti-corruption. So is there how you would say in English, a predetermined view on anti-corruption from boards, or do they equally look on both agendas? Who wants to comment on that one? Maria Rocha, from the red soil perspective.
Sorry, I didn't understand you. Sorry, could you repeat me the question?
So the question is whether your board is looking equally on human rights and anti-corruption, or whether they first of all look at anti-corruption and human rights only is a second thought.
Okay, I think that maybe I think that
you're muted, Maria.
Sorry, again, sorry, I don't know. Sorry, I think that the answer is, the question, sorry, is the last one. One other, sorry, I didn't understand you. The last question, please.
The question is whether the human rights agenda is as important for your board as the anti-corruption agenda, or whether the anti-corruption agenda is more important for you than for the board than the human rights agenda.
No, I think both of them are really important for us. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, perfect. Nicola.
Yeah, if I can add, I mean, of course, for them, they have the same importance, because here in my company, the question is how to put on the same level business and values. So all the main values like anti-corruption and human rights are they have exactly the same values for the board.
Thank you. And Rauno, you also unmuted yourself.
So I think at least, but I think I can speak on behalf of many companies. In Novartis, it's treated the same. So we have a trust and reputation committee. And what I know is that anti-corruption and human rights topics are discussed almost at the same frequency. So in that sense, it's not that, at least from a Novartis point of view, that human rights has a, let's say, lower or limited relevance. This is not the case. And one other aspect maybe that shows this, our human rights team was moved into ethics, risk, and compliance. So they are part now of our team so that we can better combine our efforts.
Thank you so much.
Excuse me, if I can add just one remark, that for us, human rights are the beliefs, the assumption on which we build our culture. So it's something more than values. I don't know if I can transmit this.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Nicola. So with that was a really interesting and rich discussion. I'm so happy that it's not me who has to summarize it, but Roberto, my boss. So over to you, Roberto.
Well, thank you. I think it has been a very interactive discussion, but also to see also this mixture of contributions from companies, also for international organizations. But at the end, what matters is the action that we have to identify right now. And what's next? I mean, how we can really push the agenda with the two realities which are different, the human rights, but also the anti-corruption. So first of all, what we were suggesting, and it's something to be discussed also with our partners from BIAC and other partners, and again, thank you, Hani, for being there, is whether we can launch also a much more regional initiative based on the document and the guidance that we have right now before us. I mean, whether we can start with some regions where this is a hot issue and where some important action is needed. And there we can work with, again, with employees and business organizations. I don't think that we are exploiting, as we should, the role of an employer and business organization against corruption, working together, of course, with governments and international organizations. By the way, we as IOE, we are also liaising with the resident coordinators of the UN system in many countries. So that would be also a way forward in order not just to bring the practical experience of companies, but also pushing the agenda, pushing the policy agenda of anti-corruption, but also link also to the human rights. So those are the suggestions that I would like to have for you, but also the most important message as a final one, and we have just 3 minutes, is to thank for this joint effort, because that's where the future is. I mean, it's no longer IOE alone, BIAC alone, OECD, ILO, the working group. At the end, if we don't have efficient partnerships, we will be disappointing many, which are expecting from us a much higher ambition on this area. So thank you very much for joining us. I think that the participation level, Matthias, has been good. Also to all the teams that have been behind this event, of course the BIAC team, also our team in IOE, including Matthias, and looking forward also to work with you further. Thank you.
Thank you. And from the IOE team, I would like again really mention Monique, who has done it. So Ina and Monique, who has done the logistic behind it. But over to you, Hani.
Yeah, thank you, Matthias, and Roberto, thank you very much for the call for further work. I can only say from the BIAC side, we are certainly interested to continue to partner with the IOE and to go deeper into certain issues and look at new initiatives. I took away a lot of useful comments from this discussion. We heard upfront the issue of trust, the importance to tear down silos in other areas as well, collective action in anti-corruption and human rights, that could be a whole guide in itself. The cooperation with other key stakeholders, the training issue was underlined by several speakers, integrating ethics into the business vision, the important role of government, the important role of business organizations. So we have like a very rich agenda, I think, for further work together. It was also really great to hear from so many companies what has been done already and what they've implemented in practice. Was very encouraging to hear these proactive examples. Let me underline again that sharing good practices is really important, because maybe not all companies are at the level yet that as the companies that presented here. In particular, we need to share also good practices with SMEs, which need additional guidance which need to hear this. And again, let me underline for this that the role of business organizations is very important. And business at OECD, BIAC and IOE would certainly be very pleased to continue to work on this. Let me also say, Drago, we very much look forward to the next consultation that we have in December. We'd be very pleased to also present the guide to the working group on bribery. We also look forward to working with the OECD on all the other important issues on the demand side, on giving guidance to SMEs, on enhancing compliance, and of course also on the M&E guidelines. And in closing, let me also add my word of thanks again to IOE, Matthias, Roberto, Monique, to my colleague Ina, of course, who, as you know, has done most of the work here. Let me thank my committee leadership from our anti-corruption committee and from our human rights side as well. And let me just close by saying, let's continue the dialogue. We can only succeed in this if we work all together. And I think it was a great first dialogue, and let's continue. Thank you.